as I was moving through my journey of really waking up to the creative power of imagination, there's definitely a point along my path where I became profoundly aware of the power of my words, the power of my speaking. Because I started to really tune into this idea of all I'm ever doing is telling stories, and the stories that I tell are a direct reflection of who I believe that I am. And what I found on my journey of awakening, what I have found is that my consciousness often grows faster than my ability to tell stories to keep up. Basically, I outgrow my wardrobe of words. I outgrow my wardrobe of words in which to clothe me. And what I found myself doing at a certain point was I stopped telling stories. There's always stories happening up there. Like you get that. You get that at this point because you understand that everything is always a story, always. But I stopped telling. I stopped speaking my stories to others. People were like, hey, what's up with you? What's going on with you? And I'd be like, oh, everything's good. Gotta keep my mouth shut. Like, because I was very, very aware of the power of my words. My consciousness had expanded in that regard, but I hadn't quite caught up to the point where I was confident speaking my new story. And I didn't want to tell an old story because I knew the power of the old story. I knew the power. I knew that when I woke up and I realized that when I speak, I create. And when I tell the old story, I reactivate the old man on some level. And I was awake enough to see that, but not quite fully, like I was kind of between outfits. I hadn't quite fully clothed myself in the new man yet. So I was like, I don't want to reactivate the old man, but I'm still trying on the clothes of the new man, and I don't really know what words are going to fit. I don't really know what story I want to tell. I just know that telling the story is the most important creative act I can animate. That telling my story is the most creative thing I can do, and I'm sitting with the power of that. And I also, like, out of respect for that power, I don't want to reactivate the old, but I'm still figuring out the new. Like I'm still expanding. I'm still growing. I don't really know how to speak from that yet. And what I started to realize through this process of sitting in presence with my experience, what I started to realize is that one of the first, actually, I think it is the first manifestation, the first tangible manifestation of a movement in mind. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Okay, so Neville Goddard talks about a movement in mind. And he talks about how when you move in mind, and we're going to go a lot more detail into this in the future in the course, just so you know, but I want to give you just this little brief context so you can really understand what I'm digging into in this moment. Neville talks about how a movement in mind is how manifestations occur. It's I believed I didn't have something and nothing changed on the outside. You know, signs follow, they do not precede. Nothing changed on the outside, but I, within my own consciousness, assumed the having of this thing that previously either I thought I didn't have or I was unaware that I had. It could kind of be described either way. And when I moved in mind and I moved in mind to where now I occupy the state that has that thing, and I've successfully moved in mind, that is what causes the whole world around us to reshape itself, to reshuffle itself, to bring back to us the evidence in the mirrors of our so-called external reality that matches the state that we've now moved in mind into, the state that we're now occupying. The movement in mind comes first. And what I started to realize just simply through being in a deep state of observation and sitting in presence with my own experience of waking up and starting to really become present with the creative power of my imagination, particularly the creative power of the stories that I tell. What I started to realize is that one of the first, not even one of the first, I would say the first manifestation, the first tangible manifestation that occurs after the movement in mind, after I have moved into the state where I now occupy the man that I desire to be. I now regain consciousness of having that thing that I forgot that I had, because that's really all it ever is. Like we fall asleep and we forget that we're endlessly abundant. So we fall into a dream where we in that dream we think that we don't have something, and then we wake up and we're like, well, wait a second, I do have that. I'm actually infinite and unlimited, and I've now moved in mind out of that little container, that little prison that I had built for myself, that little pit that I built for myself. And now I understand that, oh, I actually did have that the whole time. So let me go ahead and give it back to myself. Let me go ahead and receive what I had the whole time. And once that movement of mind has occurred, what's the very next thing that happens? What's the very next thing that happens? Neville says, you must see the world from the state, not to think of the state, but to think from the state. And if everything that we're doing all the time is always telling a story, the first thing that changes when we move in mind is the story that we're telling. That's the first thing that changes. That's the first thing that changes. That's the first tangible manifestation, the first sign that comes back to us in our experience that lets us know that we have successfully achieved a movement in mind. We are now occupying that state that we desire to occupy. How do we know? The very first thing, the story changes. And when we're telling a different story, our words change. This means our thoughts change. The habits of our thought, when we were stuck in this little dream, this little manufactured prison that we had made up for ourselves to somehow, fool ourselves into thinking that we didn't have something, this little prison came along with its little habitual patterns of thinking. In fact, you'll notice that whenever you're stuck on a particular topic in your life, if you look at all of the houses of life, you have, your career, you have money, you have, relationships, you have love, your children, your family, your house, like all of these areas of your life, all of these houses of life. And when you're stuck in one of them, what is it that's stuck? The story. The story is what's stuck. That's all it ever is. Whenever you feel stuck in some area of your life, some aspect of your life, some house of life, the only thing that's really stuck is your story that you're telling about it. And when you have that breakthrough, when you have that aha, that epiphany, that wake up, that, oh, I now see that this was a little prison and I actually can exit anytime I want simply through a movement in mind. When you have that moment, that story, which was a habit of thinking, a habitual way of being about that topic, like that's what was stuck. And that's the first thing that gets unstuck. Your story changes. Your movement in mind occurs. And instead of seeing it this way, you now see it like this. And it's a completely different experience of what would otherwise be the same event. A completely different experience. Completely different. And the fastest way that these topics, these habitual ways of being, these stuck patterns are raised to our conscious awareness as a gift to us to help us see that it's stuck, to help us see that the story that we're telling, to reflect back to us the story that we're telling. The fastest way that happens is through pain, some sort of pinch point, some sort of pressure. when that topic becomes inflamed in our life. We're super present to it. For some reason, it's like, wow, whatever it is, like in this moment, I am really, really present to my family, my relationships, my job, my money, my house, love, whatever it is. Like whatever that is really showing up and there's pain, it feels painful in some way. You're like, this doesn't feel good. That is your expanded level of consciousness reflecting back to you a story that no longer fits. You have clothed yourself in a wardrobe of words, and you have now outgrown those words. It's time for an upgrade. And that's when we start to realize that if all we're ever doing is telling stories, and if the story that we tell is a direct reflection of the state that we are occupying, there's nothing more important than the story that we tell. There's nothing more important than the story that we tell. We begin to realize one of the foremost key primary objectives in developing the habits and practices of mastery of our imagination is to master our wardrobe of words, to master the stories that we tell.